on different business to talk about the budget circumstance that we're in, to try to answer the question that we have heard asked in recent days, are we better off now than we were 4 years ago? I believe the answer to that question is very clear. And I think to answer the question, we have to take ourselves back 4 years and remember the conditions that we faced then. I will never forget, as long as I live, being called to an urgent meeting in the Capitol late one evening in September of 2008. I was the last one to arrive, and there were assembled the leaders, Republican and Democrat, of the House and the Senate, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, and the Secretary of the Treasury of the Bush administration. And the Secretary of the Treasury and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve quickly told us that they were going to take over the giant insurer, AIG, the next morning. They weren't there to ask our approval or seek our support. They were there to tell us what they were doing. And they told us that if they did not do it, they believed we would have a financial collapse within days. Mr. President, this was September of 2008. Barack Obama was not the President of the United States. George W. Bush was the President of the United States. And we were on the brink of financial collapse, according to the description of his own Secretary of the Treasury. Mr. President, let's remember what the economy was doing in the fourth quarter of 2008. The economy was shrinking at a rate of over 8%. In fact, it was shrinking at a rate of almost 9%. In the first month of 2009, the last month of the Bush administration, we lost 800,000 jobs in 1 month. So when people say, are we better off today than we were then? Well, just as a factual matter, there really can be no dispute. We are dramatically better off today than we were 4 years ago. 4 years ago, we were on the brink of financial collapse. 4 years ago, the economy was shrinking at a rate of almost 9%, and we were losing 800,000 jobs a month. Now, those are facts. They cannot be disputed. Today, we are growing, not as fast as we'd like. Jobs are being created, not as fast as we would like. But that is a dramatic improvement over 4 years ago. And let's remember, the housing market was in crisis. Home building and sales were plummeting. There were record foreclosures. The financial market crisis threatened global economic collapse. That was 4 years ago. Anybody that wonders can go back and read the headlines themselves. Because, Mr. President, those were grim days. I also remember, like it was yesterday, being part of the group that was given a responsibility to negotiate the TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. And I remember being in this complex late on a Saturday night, again with the Secretary of the Treasury of the Bush administration. And his telling us if we did not come up with a solution by 5 o'clock Sunday night, the Asian markets would open and they would collapse, and our markets would open the next day and they would collapse. So when people ask the question, are we better off today than we were 4 years ago? As a factual matter, there really is no question. None. We are dramatically better off. Mr. President, the other thing we should keep in mind is what happens after a severe financial crisis like the one we faced 4 years ago. Dr. Carmen Reinhart from the Peter Peterson Institute for International Economics and her husband, Dr. Vincent Reinhart of the American Enterprise Institute, which, by the way, is a pretty conservative place, have done an analysis, and here's what they found. After a severe financial crisis like the one we suffered 4 years ago, economic recoveries are shallower and take much longer. Here is the quote from their analysis. Real per capita GDP growth rates are significantly lower during the decade following severe financial crises. In the 10-year window following severe financial crises, unemployment rates are significantly higher than in the decade that preceded the crisis. And Mr. President, that's what we had in 2008. And again, Barack Obama was not the President of the United States. George W. Bush was President of the United States, and we had a severe financial crisis. We were on the brink of financial collapse. It takes a long time to dig out from a disaster of that magnitude. Mr. President, two of the most distinguished economists in the country, one of whom, by the way, advised John McCain in his most recent presidential race, the other, who was deputy chairman of the Federal Reserve, did an analysis of what would have happened without the federal response. What would have happened in terms of jobs? And here's what they found. With the federal response, we got 8 million jobs that we would not have had otherwise. In other words, if there had been no federal response, the red line is what would have happened to jobs. The green line is what happened as a result of federal action. 8 million fewer jobs lost than if there had been no federal response. Again, this is work that was done by Alan Blinder, former vice chairman of the Federal Reserve, and Mark Zandi, who was one of the economic advisors to John McCain in the last presidential race. Mr. President, so when we go back to this question, are we better off now than we were 4 years ago? I think the answer is unequivocally yes. We are dramatically better off than we were 4 years ago. Now, if you're one of the people who's still unemployed, you don't feel better off. I understand that. That's dreadful. That is painful. And it's painful in every way. Not only does it hurt in the pocketbook, but much more than that, it hurts the way you feel about yourself. It hurts the way you feel about your role in your family. And so we've got lots of work to do. But if we're going to be honest with people about comparing where we are today and where we were 4 years ago, there really can be no serious question about the answer to that question. Here, the economy in the fourth quarter of 2008, that's the last quarter of the Bush administration, was shrinking at a rate of almost 9%. Now the economy is growing at a rate of 1.7% for the most recent quarter. Now, is that good? No. Would we like it to be stronger? Absolutely. But is this better than almost any other developed country in the world? Yes. All of Europe is in recession. Their economies are shrinking. All of Europe. Japan is not doing as well as we are doing. So when we look around the world and compare ourselves, the United States, by comparison, is doing remarkably well given the depth of the financial crisis that we experienced. Mr. President, not only is it true in economic growth, it is true in terms of private sector jobs. Again, the last month of the Bush administration, this economy lost over 800,000 jobs in 1 month. The most recent month in the United States, we gained 103,000 jobs. That is a turnaround of over 900,000 jobs in a month. That is a dramatic improvement. Mr. President, and if we look at the stock market, we can answer that question as well. Are we better off now than we were 4 years ago? Well, this shows the stock market in March of 2009 hit its low of 65.47, the low during this period. Look where it is today, more than double what it was 4 years ago. So again, if we're seriously asking the question, are we better off than we were 4 years ago? In terms of economic growth, yes. In terms of job creation, yes. In terms of the stock market, yes. In terms of economic performance, yes. Mr. President, I've also heard my colleagues on the other side say at the convention just concluded that there's been no budget here for 3 years. Well, there's been no budget resolution, but there is a budget law that was passed called the Budget Control Act. And a law is much stronger than any resolution. A resolution is purely a congressional document, never goes to the president for his signature. A law obviously has to go to the president for his signature. So when they say there's been no budget passed, there's been no budget resolution passed, but instead Congress passed the Budget Control Act, and look what it said in the Budget Control Act. Look at what it said. The allocations, aggregates, and spending levels set in subsection B1 shall apply in the Senate in the same manner as for a concurrent resolution on the budget for fiscal year 2012. That same language is repeated in the next paragraph. The allocations, aggregates, and levels set in subsection B2 shall apply in the Senate in the same manner as for a concurrent resolution on the budget for fiscal year 2013. I just say to you, a budget is a limitation on spending. The Budget Control Act contained very clear limitations on spending for 2012 and 2013. So when our friends say there's been no budget passed by this body, oh yes, there has. There's been a budget passed for 2012, one for 2013. Instead of a resolution, it was done in a law. Now, what we don't have is a long-term plan, a 10-year plan. That's what we really need. But you know, it's pretty clear both sides are not ready yet, and perhaps won't be until we've had this election, to sit down and agree to the kind of 10-year plan that we so desperately need. Mr. President, the Budget Control Act represented the largest deficit reduction package in the history of the United States. Well, how can that be? Well, because it contained $900 billion in discretionary savings over 10 years, and it included the so-called sequester that we hear so much about that added another $1.2 trillion of spending cuts over the next 10 years, for a total of $2.1 trillion in spending cuts. That is the largest deficit reduction package that we've ever passed. So again, when people say there's no budget, there's been no action taken, it's not accurate. It's not accurate. The Budget Control Act operates in the same way as a budget resolution, and it is a law. Not a resolution that's purely a congressional document that never goes to the president. The Budget Control Act passed both houses of Congress, went to the president for his signature, and cut $2.1 trillion in spending. Now, people may not like it. A lot of things I don't like about it. Certainly the sequester. I think we ought to find alternative savings for it. But the fact is, this is now law, and it cut $2.1 trillion. That still leaves us with the problem of we're borrowing 40 cents of every dollar that we spend, and that can't be permitted to continue. So we've got to add a package on top of the Budget Control Act. We've got to do more. We've got to add, I would prefer strongly to do another at least $3 trillion. I tried to convince this Bowles-Simpson Commission to do a package of $5 trillion of deficit reduction. Actually, I tried to persuade him to do a package of $5.6 trillion of deficit reduction because we could balance the budget if we do a package that large. And, you know, the people who are on that commission will tell you, I tried repeatedly to convince my colleagues to go big. Let's do a package that really balanced the budget. And we could do it. It's not that hard, you know. I think people sometimes get it in their head that this is some impossible task. I told them, let's talk about a 6% solution. If we would do 6% more revenue than current law provides and 6% less spending, we'd save $6 trillion over 10 years and balance the budget. Now, I actually would argue for more weighting on the spending cut side of the ledger than on the revenue side. But I do this for illustrative purposes to indicate we can't do 6%. Come on. We can't do 6%? Sure we can. The occupant of the chair, Governor of West Virginia, in his previous life in politics, I'll tell you, he didn't have any trouble making tough decisions. And I'll bet you reduced spending a lot more than 6%. And you know, you survived. You're here. You're respected. You know, we can do this. Hey, we've done much tougher things than this in the past. Mr. President, I just hope that colleagues think about this carefully. This chart is so important because it looks at the spending and the revenue lines of the federal government going back to 1950. This is 60 years of our economic history on one little chart. The red line's the spending line, the green line's the revenue line. And look what it shows. We got to, in 2010, an all-time high in spending for the last 60 years. Taking out the effect of inflation, so you got an even Steven comparison over that 60-year period. And we were at a 60-year high in spending, not surprising given the dimensions of the financial crisis that we faced. But at the same time, we were at a 60-year low in revenue. If you got record spending and record low revenue, you got record deficits and record additions to the debt, and that's exactly what was happening to us. Now, we've seen some improvement in the last few years. Spending is down as a share of GDP. Revenue is up a little bit. We still have a big chasm. Mr. President, in the midst of all this comes Representative Ryan and his plan. I would say to those who might be attracted to his plan, be careful what you wish for. Be careful what you wish for. Because, first of all, the Ryan plan does not balance the budget, if ever, until 2040. And it only balances in 2040 because of certain assumptions he told the Congressional Budget Office to make about his plan and the revenue contained in it. I personally don't think it ever balances. I don't believe it ever balances. And it is absolutely an unbalanced plan. All of the deficit reduction is on the spending side. He actually digs the revenue hole much deeper, extends all the Bush-era tax cuts, and then adds hundreds of billions of dollars of more of tax cuts, primarily to the most fortunate among us. $1 trillion in tax cuts for the wealthiest. He gives those with average income of over $1 million an average tax cut of $265,000 a year. Somebody's sitting out there saying, how's that possible? A person earning $1 million a year probably doesn't pay much more than $265,000. How can they, on average, be getting a $265,000 tax cut? Remember, this is the average for everybody over $1 million. So this includes people making $1 billion a year. And there are a fortunate few who make $1 billion a year. So if you take everybody over $1 million and you average the tax cut they get under the Ryan plan, it's over $265,000 a year. He has $2.9 trillion in health care cuts. So first of all, he extends all the Bush-era tax cuts. Then he adds hundreds of billions more of tax cuts for those who are the most fortunate. And to start to make up for it, he has $2.9 trillion in health care cuts. Not million, not billion, trillion. He repeals health care reform, he shifts Medicare to vouchers, and he block grants Medicaid and cuts Medicaid drastically. And Mr. President, who benefits from Medicaid? Well, low-income people, disabled people, but also a lot of middle-income people in this country benefit from Medicaid because their folks are in nursing homes and they've spent down their assets And the only way they can stay in the nursing home is that Medicaid picks up the tab. There are hundreds of thousands of families in America, middle-class families, who have benefited from Medicaid because that's what's paid the nursing home bills for their relatives, their mom, their dad, their grandpa, their grandma. That's the truth. The Ryan budget also dramatically cuts the safety net for seniors, children, the disabled, increases uninsured by more than 30 million people. You're going to increase the number of uninsured by 30 million. Well, if you're not uninsured, why should you care? I'll tell you why you should care. Because if they aren't paid for by insurance, they're going to be paid for by all the rest of us. Because the hard reality of how the healthcare system works in America is this. If you're in a car accident, you don't have insurance, and you're taken to the hospital, you're treated. And if you don't have insurance to pay for it, and you don't have resources to pay for it, guess who pays for it? All the rest of us pay for it. That's why it's absolutely in our interest to have as many people insured as is possible. It's not just a nice thing to do, it's a smart thing to do. Because you know, one of the things we've found out, about a third of the people who don't have insurance can afford it. They can afford it. They just choose not to have it because they know if something drastic happens to them, all the rest of us are going to pay. Mr. President, there's also large cuts in the Ryan budget for education, for energy, for infrastructure, building roads, bridges, highways, and the rest. Those things undermine the engines of economic growth. So I don't think that's the way to go. So if we look at the Ryan budget plan on revenue, here's what we find. Provides $1 trillion in tax cuts for the wealthiest among us. Gives millionaires an average tax cut of more than $265,000. Does not contribute one dime of revenue to deficit reduction, and the revenues reach 18.7% of GDP by 2022. Now, why does that matter? Because the last 5 times we've balanced, the revenue of the country has been 19.6%, 19.7%, 19.8%, 20.6%. So, hey, if we're going to be serious about belling this cat, we're going to have to cut spending, we're going to have to reform the entitlements. We're also going to have to raise some revenue, hopefully not in a way that hurts economic growth, because we think we've found ways of doing it. But the Ryan tax plan, I've got to say, I don't think adds up. Why don't I believe it adds up? Well, let's look at what he proposes. First of all, he says we should reduce individual tax rates to just 2, one at 10% and one at 25%. Right now, the top rate is 35%. If you reduce that rate to 25% and you have only one other rate of 10%, that package costs $2.5 trillion over the next 10 years. So instead of filling in the hole, you dig in the hole deeper. Then he puts the top corporate rate at 25%. Again, that is a significant reduction from the top corporate rate today. That costs another $1 trillion. Then he repeals the alternative minimum tax. That costs another $670 billion. Then he repeals all the tax levies in the health care reform, another $350 billion. Then he allows the stimulus provisions to expire from the Recovery Act. That's another $210 billion. So before he starts filling in the hole, he's dug the hole deeper by almost $4.5 trillion. And he says he's going to offset all of that with individual base broadening and corporate base broadening. Mr. President, the problem with that is if you do the math, you could do this, because we're spending about $1.2 trillion a year in tax expenditures. So over 10 years, it's about $15 trillion with inflation. So you could come up with this $4.5 trillion, but what would you have to do in order to do it? Almost every objective observer has said you'd have to raise taxes on the middle class, because he says this is going to be somehow in the Romney plan revenue neutral. I don't know, the Ryan plan ever claimed to be revenue neutral, but if you're going to pay for this, how are you going to do it? What of the exemptions and the exclusions? Are you going to reduce the mortgage interest exemption? Are you going to reduce the health care tax exclusion? Because those do affect middle-class people. Let's be honest. Let's be straight. So there's no way that Congressman Ryan's plan does all the things he claims for it and not raising taxes on the middle class. And when he gets to a revenue level of 18.7% and says that's a historic average, that's true. The problem with that is we've never balanced the budget going back to 1969 with that amount of revenue. The 5 times we've balanced since 1969, that's 43 years ago, the revenue's been at 19.7, 19.9, 19.8, 20.6, 19.5. So just getting back to the historic average, I don't think is going to be enough. If we're looking at what it has taken to actually balance the budget in our history, we can see you got to be very close to 20%. And by the way, these levels of revenue were before the baby boom generation. And the baby boom generation, that's not a forecast. That's not a prediction. Those people have been born. They're alive today. And they are going to be eligible for Social Security and Medicare. And so, you know, if we're going to be honest with ourselves and honest with the American people, I don't think what Congressman Ryan's talking about really adds up. If we look at his budget on health care, we see $2.9 trillion in health care cuts. As I indicated, he repealed health care reform. And you know, I hear a lot, I hear it in my state, let's repeal health care reform. Why not? Why not? Because the Congressional Budget Office tells us if you repeal it, you add over $1 trillion to the debt. You add over $1 trillion to the debt. And you deny coverage to 30 million people that would otherwise have it. Now, Mr. President, his plan also ends the effort to promote quality over quantity of care, reopens the prescription drug donut hole that raises costs to seniors by $4,200, allows insurance companies to drop coverage when you get sick. It ends the provision allowing young adults to stay on their parents' plan until the age of 26. It shifts Medicare to vouchers in 2023 and includes after that an aggressive cap on payments that most analysts have said would dramatically increase what Medicare beneficiaries would have to pay for their own health care. Currently, Medicare pays 75% of the cost, the beneficiary pays 25%. If the Ryan plan were adopted, the original Ryan plan, he's subsequently put out other plans, but his original plan would have stood that on its head. He would have Medicare beneficiaries paying the substantial majority of the cost. Instead of Medicare beneficiaries paying 25%, he'd have them paying 68% of the cost, Medicare beneficiaries. Now, I've got a brother that's gravely ill in a hospital, Medicare eligible. I can tell you, he's getting phenomenal care. Very costly. I tell you, it would break our family. If we had to pay 68% of the cost instead of 25%, it would break our family. And we're a middle-class family. I'm talking about the extended family. So, you know, these things have real consequences. Anybody that thinks these are just, you know, political statements and they don't affect people's lives, oh yes, they do. They have a profound effect on people's lives. And the Ryan plan block grants Medicaid, shifts the cost to seniors, children, disabled, and states. Mr. President, I really don't think that's the path America has in mind. Look, I like Paul Ryan. I agree with him that we're on an unsustainable course. I was on the Bowles-Simpson Commission with him, but unlike him, I was one of the 11 that supported the recommendation of Bowles-Simpson. And of the 11 of us who did, 5 were Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 1 independent. That's about as bipartisan as you can get. There were 18 commissioners. We had to get 14 to get the recommendations to a vote here in the Congress. We got 11. That's 60% of the membership voted yes. 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 1 independent. Paul Ryan was part of Bowles-Simpson. He voted no because it wasn't just the way he wanted it. You know what? It wasn't just the way I wanted it either. I hated things on almost every page of that report. But as I told my staff, the only thing worse than being for it would be being against it, because it would have got us back on track. It would have lowered our deficit and debt by $4 trillion and done it with revenue and spending cuts and reform of entitlements. You know, maybe not as much on any one of those areas as I would do, but you know what? It would have made a profound difference in the economic future of this country. Perhaps the most striking thing to me in all the speeches at the Republican convention was the claim by Congressman Ryan, the attack on President Obama for supporting $716 billion in Medicare savings. Why was I so taken aback by that? Well, because I've read Congressman Ryan's own budget. His budget has precisely that same level of Medicare savings that he now politically attacks President Barack Obama for supporting. Boy, you see what former President Clinton said? He said, that takes real brass to attack somebody for something you have done. Congressman Ryan, you know, I mean, when you give a speech, a major speech, before tens of millions of people listening, and you attack the president for supporting $716 billion in Medicare savings, and you've got the exact same savings in your budget, shame on you. Shame on you. Mr. President, the Catholic bishops reviewed the Ryan budget, and here's what they said. They said it fails the moral test. These are the Catholic bishops of America. And look, they got issues with the president too. I understand that. I understand that. But this is what they said about the Ryan budget. They said it fails the moral test. The nation's Catholic bishops reiterated their demand that the federal budget protect the poor and said the GOP measure fails to meet these moral criteria. Mr. President, I think they got that right. Here's what a former Reagan economic advisor said about the Ryan budget. This is Bruce Bartlett, former Reagan administration economic advisor. This is what he said about the Ryan budget. And again, this is a former President Reagan economic advisor. Here's what he said about the Ryan budget. Distributionally, the Ryan plan is a monstrosity. The rich would receive huge tax cuts, while the social safety net would be shredded to pay for them. Even as an opening bid to begin budget negotiations with the Democrats, the Ryan plan cannot be taken seriously. It is less of a wish list than a fairy tale, utterly disconnected from the real world, backed up by make-believe numbers and unreasonable assumptions. Ryan's plan isn't even an act of courage. It's just pandering to the Tea Party. A real act of courage would have been for him to admit, as all serious budget analysts know, that revenues will have to rise well above 19% of GDP to stabilize the debt. Mr. President, Mr. Bartlett, I don't know the man, but he's telling the truth. He's telling the truth. As painful as it is, he's telling the truth. Mr. President, when we go to the question, are we better off than we were 4 years ago? Well, let's remember where we were 4 years ago. We were on the brink of financial collapse. Republican policies led the United States to the brink of financial collapse. They can't rewrite history. We know what happened. We tried their experiment. It didn't work. Now things have improved, not as much as we would like, and there's much more work to be done. But I trust in the judgment of the American people. I don't think they've forgotten. I certainly haven't forgotten. I will never forget where their policies took us in the fall of 2008. We were on the brink of financial collapse. Let's not repeat that failed experiment. I thank the chair and yield the floor. Notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.